It has truly been a historic week for women's rights. The Supreme Court has unanimously ruled that the use of the terms women and sex in UK law and under the Equality Act of 2010 refers to biological sex, meaning that trans women are not women in the eyes of the law. This follows a long-running legal battle between the Scottish Government and Campaign Group for Women Scotland. I am delighted to say that friend of GB News, originator of the show, comedian, writer, mentor, Andrew Doyle, joins me right now. There he is.
Hi, Josh.
Hey,
good to see you.
Happy Easter.
Yes, happy Easter to you too.
So this has been a pretty momentous week.
It's absolutely incredible. I mean, it's been what a lot of feminists and women's rights campaigners have been striving for an awful long time. And thank goodness for Women Scotland, those three women who took on the state and won. It was so important that they were able to do this because, as you know, there have been all sorts of confusions about the Equality Act 2010. Lots of campaign groups, lobbying groups, people like Stonewall, Gendered Intelligence, various groups that go into schools and companies to teach them about equality law have been misinterpreting the law. They thought that in the Equality Act, when it referred to sex, it was referring to gender identity. And of course, it was referring, of course, to biological sex. That has now been clarified thanks to this action that 4 Women Scotland have taken against the Scottish Government, who had put out guidelines explicitly saying that sex in the Equality Act means gender identity, and they were wrong about that. What's really important about this ruling is it doesn't start a new law. It doesn't. We don't start from scratch. The law has always been this. And what that means is all of those campaign groups that have been advising schools and companies that there's single-sex spaces have to include people of the opposite sex who identify into that sex category, they have been incorrect. And so now there's going to be a lot of unpicking and things to do. That's going to be going on for quite some time because this is so deeply enmeshed in the system. It will affect prisons. It'll affect hospital accommodation. The NHS has been accommodating people by gender identity rather than sex for a long time now. And that has led to all sorts of trouble. As you know, we've had the Darlington nurses and the Sandy Peggy case in Scotland, where these women working for the NHS as nurses have been forced to undress in front of men. And these tribunals are ongoing. This ruling will impact those as well. It feels as though this will clarify absolutely everything in law. And one of the key things that I want to say here, and I think it's very important that people understand, this is being framed in a lot of the media as a debate about trans rights versus women's rights. It isn't that at all. Trans rights are completely unaffected by this ruling. This is about preserving women's rights and their right to single-sex spaces. Trans rights are completely unaffected, and that is a red herring to even sort of go down that road.
There's been a lot of misinformation over the last couple of days, misrepresenting arguably what the ruling means. I mean, you've summed it up, but what kind of arguments have you seen that run counter to what you're saying?
This video is sponsored by Saily. Saily is a brand new eSIM service app. What it does is get you a local SIM card that you can use when you're traveling, so you don't have to pay those crazy roaming fees just to send a text back home. They've got eSIM plans in over 160 countries and 8 regions. So pretty much wherever you're going, they'll be able to make sure you're connected. So how does it work? Well, all you've got to do is hit our link in the description to download the app. It will work on iOS or Android. Buy a plan, you can choose the best time frame for you, and then just install the eSIM on your phone. When you land at your holiday destination, you can activate your plan instantly. Saily eSIMs only ever have to be installed once, so when you go on your next trip, you just buy a plan for a new country, turn that eSIM back on, and just like that, you could be watching the GB News YouTube channel. You can be connected anywhere you go, and you don't have to deal with patchy Wi-Fi in your hotels. So get sorted for your next trip by downloading Saily using the link in the description below, and if you use our code NEWS at checkout, you'll get an exclusive 15% discount on us.
Well, a lot of trans activists, of course, have been misinformed for many years. They've been told that, say, if someone was born male and now identifies as female and has a gender recognition certificate, that they therefore have the right to enter women-only spaces like toilets, changing facilities, that kind of thing, even domestic violence refuge centres. That was never the case. So what has happened is a lot of people have been misinformed, perhaps willfully, perhaps not willfully, but either way, of course, you're going to get a bit of a backlash because a lot of people have been told lies. They've been told something that isn't true. And they feel, therefore, like their rights have been taken away from them with this ruling. But that isn't true. Their right, they never had the right to go into a female-only space. That right was not there. Trans rights are still very much protected insofar as discrimination against people under the category of gender reassignment is still very much protected under the Equality Act 2010. And that is something that the Supreme Court, in its judgment, in its ruling, was very, very clear about. So when you see, for instance, the campaigners, the activists yesterday vandalizing statues in Parliament Square, urinating publicly, holding up placards that were calling for the deaths of women. Pretty repugnant behavior, but they're reacting against a fantasy. They're reacting against something that hasn't happened. Their rights are still intact. It's just that now women's rights, and specifically as well gay rights, are now enforced, confirmed to exist within the Equality Act, within law. That's a really good. It's really good news for anyone who is a genuine progressive.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on the point that you were making, and maybe in a slightly different way, the way that I see it is that this has been framed, certainly by trans activists, that it's the flip side of the same coin. And what this ruling basically says is that they are two different coins, and always have been two different coins. There's women's rights, that's one coin, and there's trans rights as another. It's not like they have to be in competition with each other.
No, exactly. And I don't think there was ever a situation where these rights had to be in competition, had to be locking horns. That I think is a major misunderstanding. That misunderstanding appears to be so widespread. I mean, right up to the top of government. I mean, we've seen just the other day these leaked WhatsApp messages among the Labour Party, where you've had senior members of the Labour government who now think that this ruling was catastrophic. Angela Eagle has said that this is a catastrophe for transgender rights. It's absolutely, that's factually wrong. The trans people have the same rights as absolutely everyone else. The complication came about because a gender recognition certificate created a kind of legal fiction. Nobody ever was suggesting that someone can actually change sex. It is a matter of incontestable fact that no human being has ever changed sex. That's just not something we can dispute. That's not even something the law courts can dispute. They can sometimes. In Australia, we had a judge recently in the Sal Grover case saying that sex is changeable, right? Well, it's not, no matter what a judge says. That's not something that can be disputed. But the creation of this legal fiction has led to all sorts of confusion. And so no wonder people are angry. But actually what this Supreme Court judgment does is it restores clarity to these debates. And we should be able to get on with a situation where anyone who identifies as trans deserves the same rights as everyone else. They shouldn't be discriminated against. The Supreme Court made that clear. But women's sex-based rights and gay people's sex-based rights are dependent on the recognition that biological sex exists. I mean, in Australia, it's currently illegal for lesbians to have their own gatherings, to gather without men who identify as women present. Well, no man can be a lesbian, right? So that's the trickiness. When the law gets involved with attempting to redefine reality, then we get ourselves in a mess. And what the Supreme Court has done, and I think this will filter out across the globe, the Supreme Court has clarified that, of course, this legal fiction enshrined in the gender recognition certificate doesn't actually change someone's sex. That's not possible. And therefore, these preservations, these single-sex spaces will now be preserved. There'll be a lot of arguing. There are a lot of people denying it. I saw an advisory body just yesterday, a school's advisory body, again misrepresenting the law in its new guidance off the back of the Supreme Court ruling. If schools follow that, then they will be breaking the law. And I think every company has to be very, very careful now about if they've taken advice from Stonewall and these sorts of groups that have not accurately represented the law, then they will lose this battle because it's now confirmed. And thank goodness for absolutely everyone. Everyone's a winner here. Trans people, they win because their rights are enshrined in that Equality Act. Women will win because they get their single-sex spaces back. Gay people win because they can gather and assemble without the opposite sex turning up. It just seems to me like this is good news across the board, and I don't think the controversy is actually reflective of the facts in the case. Yeah, well, you mentioned anger there, but there are people who feel that this is catastrophic to their rights, who don't see the things the way that you do. Do you think that in time they will come to see the positive in this ruling, or do you think this unfortunately is going to continue, but it's going to just be rhetoric now because the law doesn't agree with them? It's tricky because, as I say, for years you've had misrepresentations, and the truth is, a lot of people just don't understand these issues. I mean, in the Labour Party, you've got people like Nadia Whittome, Lloyd Russell Moyle was another one. I know he's not an MP now, but people like that, Alicia Kearns on the Conservative side. You know, you've got these prominent politicians who don't understand the issues, who think that they're standing up for progressive values, and they're doing the precise opposite. They're promoting the idea that society ought to be organized according to gender identity, which is a metaphysical belief that is shared by very, very few, a tiny minority of the population. Most people don't believe in such a thing. And gay rights, as we know, is predicated on this notion that some people are attracted to members of their own sex. That is completely upended if you advance this notion that gender identity has to be the backbone to all public health policy and all sorts of other policies. So a lot of Labour people are actually advancing a very anti-gay, anti-women cause without knowing it. This is the real problem. Now, you've had Wes Streeting is a very good example, you know, Health Secretary Wes Streeting, who's come around to this. He now understands because he's actually read about the issues. He's spoken with people like Sex Matters. He's actually like LGBT Alliance. He's actually talked to people. He now understands the issues, and he's reached a sensible conclusion. We saw this with the implementation of the findings of the Cass review. But you still have politicians who don't understand, who are getting this completely backwards, and have been gulled into promoting an anti-gay, anti-woman philosophy without understanding the issues. Now, what I would say to people like Keir Starmer and Nadia Whittome and all of those people who have said some ridiculous things in the past about this issue is they should sit down with Sex Matters, with For Women Scotland, with the Lesbian Project, with LGBT Alliance, with all these groups that have done such incredible work, and just try to understand the issues. You know, these people have outlined them meticulously. If you go to the Sex Matters website, all of these details are meticulously outlined in painstaking detail. There's no excuse for Keir Starmer not to understand this. Keir Starmer has refused, by the way, to meet with Rosie Duffield, a woman who was driven out of the Labour Party, who couldn't even go to the Labour Party conference because of the threat she was getting on her life. She was right. She was right all along. And more, increasingly, members of the Labour government are coming round to this point of view, but there will still be these stalwarts, these diehards, who not only don't understand, but are determined that everyone else should have a misunderstanding of this situation. It's a really bad situation for the government to be in. So they really do now need to read the judgment, reflect on the judgment, read the work by campaign groups like Sex Matters, which is not bigoted, it's not transphobic, it's not anti-trans, it's not against anyone. It is simply reiterating the point that sex-based rights must, of course, incorporate the notion that biological sex exists. And it's strange to me that Starmer hasn't made more of an effort. He also, by the way, hasn't said that he's going to deal with this situation with his own party. You know, if you have WhatsApp messages, and I know it's early days, we don't know the whole story about this, but if there are indeed WhatsApp messages within the government saying, how can we mobilize and push back against this Supreme Court ruling, that is very dangerous territory. That is the government trying to undermine the law.
It's very hard to admit that you're wrong. Fortunately, I've never had to do so. So, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Doyle.
Thanks for having me.
Joining me now is the Diversity and Inclusion Facilitator, Katie John West. Katie. Hello, Katie. Thank you so much for joining us here. I went on your social media earlier and to see your position on this. It seemed very reasoned, and it seemed very much about where the trans community moves forward from this decision on Wednesday.
Well, yeah, we have to move forward. I do somewhat disagree with Andrew, but also quite healthily agree with him in parts. I don't think trans people are going to interpret it as, yes, their rights are protected. I think we still do have a weird policy, and to me, any trans person that tries to kind of reject biological sex is kind of, yes, they are living in fantasyland to some extent. Biological sex has always been biological sex. It's kind of not even O-level biology to actually, confess what a woman is, what a man is. Obviously, we've had politicians running around in circles trying to avoid saying it. And I think we've had two things that have perhaps gone wrong, maybe it's not the right word, but two things that have happened in the last 10 years or so. One is we've erred on the side of inclusion, and what this judgment gives is greater permission to legitimately err on the side of exclusion. That's kind of one aspect. And the other thing is we've always had this kind of what I would call Schrodinger's sex, that, nobody's sex exists until asked, and that somebody created this additional category of gender when realistically the only sex exists in legal sense. But we still, the thing is the I reread all 88 pages of it again today. That's the second time this week.
I tried to. In the end, I just read a summation. It's much easier.
Yeah, I know, because there's but it's very important because there's a lot of history in there going back to 1970, Corbett versus Corbett, April Ashley, whose marriage was, dissolved on the basis that, because she couldn't be actually a woman, even though she was living as a woman, because she couldn't actually be a woman, therefore her marriage in law couldn't exist. So sexist biology, it's obvious and it shouldn't have been an issue. But how we incorporate, how we navigate society with people whose gender is lived differently, that goes back obviously to 2004, the Gender Recognition Act, which was kind of, we had to put into to law because of judgments from the European Court of Human Rights, etc., and trying to fulfill human rights law. And one of the things that actually says, and the judgment last week actually said this relates to the definition of woman, within the Equality Act, etc. And I completely get that. However, the Gender Recognition Act still does exist, and it says that a person's sex, for all purposes, becomes that of the acquired gender. Now, yes, 2010 follows 2004, but there are aspects of the Gender Recognition Act, and Andrew was just saying transgender rights haven't been undone, they still exist. We still have Equality Act protections based on transition, and we still have the Gender Recognition Act. But how it has been interpreted is going to change. Because, as I said, I think a number of organisations trying to be inclusive, trying to be kind, etc., have erred on the side of inclusion. But Baroness Faulkner said there's no obligation to provide single-sex spaces, but where you do, the presence of any trans person in them automatically makes them a mixed-sex space. And then the next day, Lord Sumption was saying, you no longer now have to include trans women, but nor are you obligated to exclude them. So it's no longer discriminatory to exclude trans in that sense. And he said, I don't think Baroness Faulkner is right. She responded the next day, softening her tone and dropping the mention of toilets. So I do think the interpretation of woman, which should be really simple, how that's played out in life is going to be a little bit messy in the coming months. We await statutory guidance over the summer. But yeah, it's going to be messy.
Well, and then perhaps we should have hashtag debate. And do you think that that's really what got us into this position? Was this inability that people lost their jobs, mostly women, for raising these discussions? They were called bigots, assaulted. And do you think now, I'm not saying, of course, the trans community is not some homogenous group, but do you think the trans community will get to a place where these conversations can actually happen, where these fine conversations can be discussed now?
Have you met trans activists? So I've always been up for debate, and so I've been involved in various free speech kind of fora to actually debate all of these things, and I've always been available to discuss. But I'm classed as an outlier because I am willing to discuss these things, because I can say that biologically, yes, I'm a man, but also I have transitioned. There's some additional complications in my own backstory biologically, but I still know what a man is, and I'm not offended if someone uses he of me. It's not my preferred pronoun, but actually I'm not going to force someone's language changes. So, as I say, I'm an outlier in that sense. I don't think you're going to get the average trans person to suddenly sit down and have a calm conversation because they feel an existential kind of erasure. Now, I get that because I also believe that a lot of women over the last 5 to 10 years felt their language, their identity was having an existential erasure when people, again, erring on the side of inclusion, went too far and started changing their language and actually removing references to women in its obvious sense everywhere where it existed. And I think had we gone about that differently, had we done not no debate, but actually got involved in discussion and had respectful conversations and heard both sides, there might have been a different path forward through this. Because go back 20 years ago when I was first out sort of thing, there was a kind of, turn a blind eye approach. There was a kind of British tolerance, hey, not in a week. Okay, we know you're trans, we know you don't pass, but we also don't see you on your own, one person kind of with a friend sort of thing, as as a massive threat to us in that sense. But I do think there's been a media magnifying of isolated cases to make it look like we are now the same thing that was magnified in the 70s and 80s, the scary homosexual, in that sense. And
Katie,
I think
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but because I do not want to erase you. I want to be very clear about that. But I have been told in my ear that we do definitely have to go to a break.